Hi everybody, this is Anne. I get a lot of requests from people asking if we would make more videos dealing with hand building pottery. As such, I've tried to design a lot of projects and demonstrated a lot of techniques. For this video, I thought I'd take a different tack. I'm going to give you my favorite top 10 must-have tools that I keep handy when doing my hand building projects. Plastic pastry mats are my go-to work surface. Clay naturally sticks to smooth, non-porous surfaces, which this is, but the mat is also flexible, allowing it to peel away easily as long as the clay is not too soggy. When working with slabs, they need to have consistent depths. These yardsticks from the hardware store are perfect for the job and very inexpensive. I actually have a collection of sticks in different depths. I love to cruise the thrift stores for discarded items with unusual shapes. Many of them may not be usable for their intended purposes any longer, but they can still be used by us as pottery drape molds. The multifacets on this bowl would create challenges, so I thought it'd make for a great demo. I started by wiring off clay from my block and softening it a bit with my hands. I began rolling it down with my rolling pin. As it got thinner, I placed the yardsticks on either side and rolled until the slab was the same thickness as the rulers. With a wet rubber rib, I smoothed the clay and compressed it to help prevent cracking. I placed the mold over the clay and cut a circle of clay beyond the boundaries of the bowl to make sure I have enough clay to use but eliminating the excess. I needed to elevate the mold, so I placed a bottle of glaze on the banding wheel and steadied the bowl on top. I placed a piece of plastic wrap over that to prevent the clay from sticking. I centered the slab over the glaze bottle and gently pressed the clay down until I could feel the bowl underneath. I worked it slowly to avoid buckling, but making sure the edges were tucked under the bowl's rim. Starting at the top center, I used a damp sponge to form the clay into all the undulations of the bowl. The clay is stressed as it stretches around each facet. If it's too dry, it may begin to crack, but the water from the sponge helps keep the clay moist to prevent that. Now that I have the general shape, I use a wet thumb to press the clay tighter to the surface and get much nicer definition. Finally, I run a wet finger around the bottom foot to define that as well. I want to make sure I can really see where the bowl ends, so I use a wet thumb to lightly press the clay under so I can see where to cut. You can use an X-Acto knife if you're comfortable with that, but I'm more comfortable using a needle tool to cut the excess clay from along the rim line. Again, I'm using a damp sponge along the bottom rim to soften that sharp line, but also moisten and compress the delicate rim to avoid cracking. Normally, I would let this dry and set up for about a half an hour before taking the form out to avoid soggy clay from misshaping, but I want to show you what the inside looks like. The plastic makes it easy to dislodge, and then you just peel the plastic away. Here's one I made earlier that's been bisque fired. I took one extra step of forming a strip of clay into a circle and adding it to the bottom for a foot for this elegant look. I glazed it with multiple commercial glazes including obsidian, sapphire float, running hot chowder, and golden honey. I love how the glaze drips down from the facets into the center, leaving a starburst pattern. Another one of my favorite things to have on hand is various sizes of wooden dowel rods. Seems like such a simple item, but I found them to come in handy for quite a few things. Along that same vein, stiff cardboard carpet tubes or mailing tubes can also be used and often come in the bigger sizes than the dowels. The porous paper surface has a better chance of the clay not sticking to it. I'll show you one way to use those. I start with a thick log of 1.5 pounds of wedged fresh clay, damp but not soggy. I rolled it to reduce the height until it was about 1.5 inches off the mat. The excess clay naturally forms divots along both edges as the clay repositions itself. Using the smaller dowel rod, I insert it into the center of the divot about halfway down, then pull it back out. I turned the log over and inserted it again, connecting it to the other end all the way through. Using equal pressure from each hand, I rolled the dowel over the clay like a rolling pin to stretch it out. As the clay expands out a bit, I removed the smaller dowel and inserted the next size. I continued to stretch it again. Of course, the stretching will start to dry out the clay and stress it, so it's a good idea to rub a little water over the surface and rib it to compress and re-moisten the clay and prevent cracking. I especially want to keep an eye on the edges. They may dry out quicker than the body, so really wet and compress those. The log is big enough for the mailing tube. Again, I rolled and stretched it out. My goal is to make the clay log about the circumference of the carpet tube, so I stretched it larger than the tube so I could insert that. Now I need to work backwards to tighten the log around the tube. With both hands firmly grasping as much of the log as I could, I began squeezing and twisting the clay towards the tube. I worked the clay up and back down, twisting it as I went until it shrunk down around the tube. I then used my damp red rubber rib to smooth the surface and remove any finger marks. I flattened the bottom of the clay log to help it sit flat, but that also creates an uneven layer of clay along the bottom, so I set it on the banding wheel and used my needle tool to cut the very bottom strip away. Using my needle steadied against a ruler, I cut away the excess clay at the top for an even rim. For the bottom, I placed a slab on my banding wheel. I lightly traced around the clay form. Then I scored the edges of both and slipped one edge and attached the two together. Using a damp paintbrush, I sealed the seam between the two. I cut the excess clay away with a needle tool. I sealed the edges with my finger. I made sure the tube wasn't stuck to the clay, then I removed it. Now I can work the sharp edges of the rim to round them and soften and shape them how I like. When I'm done with that, I like to reinsert the tube to make sure that I haven't knocked it out around. Now I'm going to put feet on the bottom of this mug. Here's another one of my favorite tools to make them. It's a round measuring spoon. I shape a little round ball of clay. I place plastic wrap over the spoon, then insert the ball of clay, really pushing it down into the cavity. I turn over the spoon and push down on the top while wiggling it back and forth to cut off the excess clay. I peel away the plastic wrap to reveal the perfect little foot. Now I can score, slip, and attach it into place. For the handle, I could pull one, but to save time, I just love this diamond core adjustable extruder tool. Starting with a flat block of clay, I pull the tool over the surface. Then I can peel it away from the block for the perfect handle every time. As my mug is too wet for a handle just yet, I'll form it on this mat to demonstrate what it'll look like when I attach it. Here's one I made earlier from the mail tube. I shaped out the rim a little, then attached the feet and the handle. I glazed it with white glaze around all the imagery and the inside for this cute little chickadee mug. Finally, I designed an all-in-one template for a hand-built slab container. As the paper's too flexible to hold the shape, I'll show you another one of my have-to-have hand-building tools, roofing felt or tar paper, which you can get in any hardware store. I simply trace the template on the tar paper and cut it out. This material is foldable but stiff enough to hold a shape. I began by folding the sides up along the creases. I rolled out a slab large enough to cut out the template and placed it on a sheet of plastic wrap for easy removal. I placed the tar paper template over the slab and rolled it onto the clay so it stuck down tightly, but not too tight. I then cut away the excess clay. I turned over the slab and peeled away the plastic. Another of my favorite things is this beveling tool. It makes consistent cuts so that the width of the clay is always the same. Starting along the inner edges only, I work it down each side. I scored each of the beveled edges. Before attaching the sides, I rolled out small coils and stuck them lightly along each of the 4 edges in preparation for folding. I also rolled out balls of clay and stuck them lightly at all 4 corners to prevent cracking at those very vulnerable points. Now I can slip the first edge and fold up the first 2 sides. Hold the back of the 2 sides together and work the clay coil and ball of clay into the seam, first using the brush and then my fingers. Really work in that clay coil even up to the top of the seam. At the same time, fit the outer edges of the template together too. Continue with this step all the way around until you have the piece together. Once the clay is dried to where it's not soggy, slowly peel the template away from the edges. This may pull some of the seams a bit loose. I can work and compress the outer seams with the rubber rib so they seal tightly together. As the piece stiffens up, I like to rib the texture off of the sides from where it was stuck to the roofing felt. Now here's one I made earlier, where I also cut a strip of a slab, curled it into a round rim, and scored and attached it to the top with a small coil around the seam. I sectioned off the piece, then painted a quarter of it with a solid underglaze color, then slip trailed the leaves on top. On the other 3/4 of the piece, I painted the hummingbirds. If you're new to hand building, it's a good idea to figure out your favorite hand building technique and then build your supplies based on that. Maybe these tools could be a good start for your collection. Thanks to the newest members of our Little Street Pottery Research Facility team. If you'd like to join the team and earn a title, click on the Super Thanks button or the link to buy me a coffee. It also really helps us out if you hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. See you next time in the studio.